My name is Jacob Miller, and on December 3rd, 2007, my life changed forever. I was born and raised in a strict Amish community in Ohio, where every moment of my life was dictated by tradition and religious law. From the time I could walk, I was taught that obedience to the Ordnung, our set of religious rules, was the only path to salvation. There was no electricity, no modern conveniences, no outside influences. The elders taught us that questioning our way of life was dangerous, and if you did, you risked being shunned, cut off from your family and community forever. I followed the rules perfectly, believing that if I obeyed, God would accept me. I worked the fields, prayed daily, and lived as righteously as I knew how. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. At night, I would lie awake, asking myself questions I was too afraid to say out loud. Is this enough? Does God actually know me? Or am I just going through the motions? But in my world, doubt was not an option. You didn't question the faith. You didn't question the elders. And you certainly didn't question whether our rules were truly the key to salvation. So, I did what I was supposed to. I buried those doubts deep inside, convinced they were sinful. I never could have imagined that one winter morning, everything I believed would be shattered in an instant. It was early December, and the roads were slick with ice and snow. That morning, I had gone into town to pick up supplies, bundled tightly against the cold as I guided my horse-drawn buggy through the quiet countryside. The air was crisp, and my breath formed clouds in front of me as I urged the horse forward. I had taken this route hundreds of times before. It was familiar, predictable, just like the rest of my life. But as I approached a blind curve on the narrow road, something felt off. I heard it before I saw it, the distant roar of an engine, growing louder by the second. A truck, moving far too fast for these icy roads, came speeding around the bend. My heart pounded as I yanked the reins, but there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow, and the ditch beside me was steep. Before I could even cry out, the headlights filled my vision. And then impact, a deafening crash, a force so powerful it felt like the world had exploded around me. Everything went black. I felt myself being thrown, weightless for a split second, before slamming into something hard. But strangely, there was no pain, just an eerie silence. I expected to wake up on the frozen ground, gasping for breath, maybe with broken bones. But instead, I woke up to nothing. No road, no snow, no sound. Just an endless, suffocating darkness stretching in every direction. At first, I thought my eyes were just adjusting and that any second now, I'd see the sky or the wreckage around me. But as the seconds passed, the darkness didn't fade. It deepened. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something else entirely. It felt heavy, pressing against me like a thick fog, wrapping around me like chains. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I wasn't lying on the ground. I wasn't anywhere at all. Then I tried to speak. Hello. My voice should have echoed, should have made some kind of sound. But the moment the words left my lips, they were swallowed by the emptiness. It was as if sound didn't exist here. My heart pounded. Where am I? Am I dead? The thought sent a chill through me. Not just because I might be dead, but because this wasn't what I had been taught about death. I had always believed that if I lived righteously, followed the rules, obeyed the elders, I would wake up in heaven if I died. There was supposed to be light, angels, peace, but there was none of that. Only darkness, cold, silence, and the terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong all along. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The weight of the darkness pressed harder against me, as if it were alive, as if it knew I was starting to realize the truth. And then I saw it, a flicker, a tiny, distant light, no bigger than a candle flame, far off in the endless void. It was the first thing I had seen since waking up in this place, and despite the fear gripping me, a small part of me dared to hope. The light began to grow, pushing back the darkness. As it came closer, I felt something I hadn't felt since arriving here, warmth. Not just physical warmth, but something deeper. Presence. A love so overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. The darkness recoiled as if it was afraid, shrinking away as the light consumed more and more of the space around me. And then, I saw him. Jesus stood before me, radiant and unlike anything I had ever imagined. His presence was powerful, yet gentle, blinding yet soothing. He wasn't just shining, he was the light. My breath caught in my throat as his eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew he saw everything. Every secret doubt, every moment of pride, every time I had judged someone, believing myself to be more righteous. And yet, there was no condemnation in his gaze, only love. I wanted to speak, to explain myself, to tell him that I had only been doing what I thought was right. But before I could form the words, he spoke first. His voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, strong, yet gentle, filled with both authority and kindness. "Jacob," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice sent a warmth through me that I couldn't describe. "Why have you relied on the works of your hands and the traditions of men instead of trusting in my grace?" His words cut through me like a blade. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Deep down, I knew the truth. I had spent my entire life striving, believing that my obedience to the rules would save me. I thought that if I followed the Ordnung perfectly, if I lived simply and kept my head down, I would earn my place in heaven. But now, standing before Jesus, I saw just how wrong I had been. My faith had never been about truly knowing him. It had been about proving myself. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of my mistakes crushed me. "I thought I was doing what you wanted," I wanted to say. "I thought following the rules was the only way." But before I could speak, Jesus took a step closer. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, and the moment he touched me, a peace unlike anything I had ever known flooded my soul. The fear, the doubt, the guilt, it all melted away. In that moment, I knew I was fully known, and I was fully loved. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. They spilled down my face as I fell to my knees before him, overwhelmed by everything I was feeling. I had spent my entire life trying to earn God's love, yet here I was, completely broken, completely unworthy, and still, he loved me. Not because of what I had done, but because of who he was. Jesus knelt beside me, his voice gentle but firm. "Jacob, I have been with you all along, waiting for you to turn to me. The rules cannot save you. Your works cannot save you, but my love can. My grace is enough." His words pierced through me, breaking down every false belief I had held onto. I had always thought that grace had to be earned, but now I realized it was something freely given. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood. A new scene unfolded before my eyes. I saw myself back in my Amish community, but I wasn't the same man anymore. I was different, lighter, freer. Instead of living in fear, I was living in love. Instead of judging others, I was sharing this truth with them. I saw people I had known my whole life. My father, my brothers, my friends. Listening to my words, their eyes filled with the same questions I had once been too afraid to ask. Some rejected it, but others were ready to hear the truth. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with both love and purpose. "Jacob, I am giving you a second chance," he said. "You have seen the truth, and now you must share it. Many will reject you, some will turn against you, but do not be afraid. I will be with you always." My heart pounded at his words. A second chance. A mission. A calling. I had spent my whole life believing that salvation was something I had to earn. And now, Jesus himself was telling me that it was never about what I did. It was about what he had already done. I looked at him, unsure. How can I do this? How can I go back? I thought of my family, my community, the only life I had ever known. What would they say when I told them what I had seen? Would they listen? Would they turn their backs on me? The fear crept in, but before it could take hold, Jesus spoke again. "Do not rely on your own strength, Jacob. My power is made perfect in weakness. Trust in me." The light around us grew even brighter, enveloping me in warmth and peace. I could feel the darkness shrinking away completely, unable to stand in his presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the warmth lingered, and as I opened my eyes, gasping for breath, I found myself lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by the wreckage of my buggy. I was back. I was alive, but everything had changed. I lay there for a moment, my body aching, my breath unsteady. The icy wind bit at my skin, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still reeling from what had just happened. I had been dead, or at least I had been somewhere beyond this world. I had seen Jesus. I had heard his voice. And now I was back. But why? The answer hit me immediately: because he sent me back. Because I had a mission. I could hear muffled voices in the distance. Someone was calling my name. Footsteps crunched through the snow, and soon, I felt hands gripping my shoulders, lifting me up. Jacob, Jacob, can you hear me? It was my younger brother, Samuel. His face was pale with worry. Behind him, others from our community stood in shock, their eyes darting between me and the wreckage of my buggy. The horse had run off. The truck that had hit me was nowhere to be seen. And yet, I was alive. In the days that followed, I struggled to find the right words to describe what I had experienced. How do you explain something so profound, so life-altering? How do you tell your family, the people who raised you, to believe that following rules was the only way to heaven, that you had met Jesus himself and he told you otherwise? I wanted to share everything, but I was afraid. I knew what happened to those who questioned the Amish way. And yet, deep in my soul, I knew I couldn't stay silent. Jesus had given me the truth, and the truth had set me free. The first time I told my story, it was around the dinner table with my family. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she passed the bread. My younger siblings, including Samuel, listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I need to tell you what happened to me, I said, and then, slowly, carefully, I told them everything. I spoke of the accident, the darkness, and the overwhelming fear I felt when I thought I was lost forever. I told them how my life flashed before my eyes. Not just the good, but the moments of judgment, pride, and spiritual emptiness I had ignored for so long. My mother wiped tears from her eyes when I described seeing Jesus, how his presence had filled me with love and peace unlike anything I had ever known. And then I told them the hardest part, that salvation wasn't about rules, that Jesus himself had told me that my works could never save me, only his grace could. The silence that followed was heavy. My father set his fork down, his jaw tight. My mother looked at him, then back at me. It was my brother Samuel who spoke first. Jacob, are you saying that the Ordnung is wrong? His voice was hesitant, almost afraid. I shook my head. I'm saying that the Ordnung cannot save us, that only Jesus can. My father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't understand what you're saying, he muttered. This is dangerous thinking, Jacob. And in that moment, I realized the truth I had been sent back to share would not be easily accepted. The tension in the room was suffocating. My father's eyes, usually filled with quiet authority, now held something else, concern and fear. Jacob, he said, his voice low but firm, we do not question the Ordnung. It is the way our people have lived for generations. It is what keeps us close to God. I could hear the finality in his tone, the warning beneath his words. In our world, questioning the rules was the first step toward losing everything: family, community, even your identity. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't pretend that Jesus hadn't spoken to me. I swallowed hard, choosing my words carefully. I'm not saying we abandon our way of life, I said, my voice steady but pleading. I'm saying that the rules were never meant to replace a relationship with Jesus. He told me that salvation isn't something we earn. It's a gift. My father's face darkened. And who are you to say such things? Do you think you know better than the elders? Than our forefathers? His words stung, but before I could answer, my mother spoke. Her voice was quiet, but filled with something I didn't expect: emotion. Jacob, she said, her eyes welling with tears. "Are you certain of what you saw? That it was truly Jesus?" I met her gaze, my own eyes burning. More certain than I've ever been of anything. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that I hadn't expected: longing. Had she, too, questioned? Had she, too, secretly wondered if the life we lived was truly enough? My father, however, was unmoved. He pushed his chair back, standing abruptly. "Enough of this," he said. "You are walking a dangerous path, Jacob. Be careful where it leads you." And with that, he left the table. As my father walked away, a heavy silence filled the room. My mother sat still, her hands folded in her lap, staring down at the table. My siblings shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. Deep inside, I knew that nothing I had said would change my father's mind. Not yet. He had spent his entire life believing that obedience to the Ordnung was the only way to please God. To him, what I was saying wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. It threatened everything he had built his life upon. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling above me. My father's warning echoed in my mind. "Be careful where this path leads you." I knew what he meant. If I continued to speak about what I had seen, if I refused to fall back in line, there would be consequences. I could be shunned, cast out, cut off from my family, my friends, my entire world. The thought terrified me, but even as fear crept in, something stronger pushed back against it: the presence of Jesus. His words were still fresh in my heart. "Do not be afraid. I am with you always." In the days that followed, I tried to go back to life as it was before, but everything had changed. I saw things differently now. I no longer went through the motions of faith. I longed for something deeper, something real. When I prayed, I spoke to Jesus as if he were right beside me, because I knew he was. And slowly, I began to notice something I had never seen before. There were others in my community who felt the same emptiness I once had. They, too, had questions they were too afraid to ask. And I knew my mission was just beginning. It started with whispers, quiet conversations in the barn, stolen glances after church. Some in my community avoided me, unwilling to be associated with what they saw as rebellion. But others wanted to know more. I could see it in their eyes, the same doubts I had once buried, the same longing for something deeper. They wanted to ask the questions they had been too afraid to speak aloud. One evening, as I was tending to the horses, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Caleb, a young man I had grown up with, standing there, his expression uneasy. "Jacob," he said hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I heard what you told your family about Jesus." He swallowed hard, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Is it true? Did he really say that the rules won't save us?" I met his gaze and nodded. "Yes, Caleb. I saw him. I heard him. And he told me himself. His grace is enough." Caleb let out a shaky breath, his eyes searching mine for any sign of doubt. "I felt it too," he admitted. "Like I'm doing everything right, but I'm still missing something. I've been too afraid to say it out loud." He looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if Jesus told you this, then maybe I don't have to be afraid anymore." That moment changed everything for me. Caleb wasn't the only one who felt this way. There were others, just like him, who had spent their entire lives following the rules but still felt distant from God. They were afraid to question, afraid to even consider that there might be more to faith than obedience. But now, for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Jesus hadn't just sent me back for myself, he had sent me back for them. Word of my experience spread quickly, and soon more people began approaching me in secret. Some were curious, hesitant, afraid of what it might mean if they truly listened to what I had to say. Others were desperate for something real, something beyond rules and rituals. "I pray, but I never feel him," one man admitted. "I follow the rules, but I don't feel saved," another whispered. And with each conversation, I saw the same thing in their eyes, the same emptiness I had once felt. But the more I spoke, the more the opposition grew. The elders had heard what I was saying, and they were not pleased. I was warned, first gently, then more firmly, to stop speaking about my experience. "You are sowing doubt, Jacob," one elder told me. "The ordnung keeps us close to God. If you turn from it, you turn from Him." But I knew the truth now. The ordnung was not what kept us close to God, Jesus was. And no matter what it cost me, I couldn't stay silent. The warnings quickly turned into something more. I noticed the way people started looking at me differently. Some with concern, others with outright suspicion. Conversations would stop when I entered a room, and longtime friends avoided my gaze. One evening, an elder approached me after church, his face heavy with disappointment. "Jacob, you need to stop this," he said firmly. "You are leading people astray. If you continue, there will be consequences." I knew exactly what he meant. If I didn't stop, I would be shunned. Shunning was more than just being cast out, it was losing everything. If the elders decided to shun me, my family wouldn't be allowed to speak to me. My community would act as if I no longer existed. I would have nowhere to go, no way to survive outside of the life I had always known. And yet, as I stood there, listening to the elders' warning, I felt something unexpected: peace. The old fear was gone. Jesus had already told me what would happen, and He had promised, "I will be with you always." That night, I sat alone, staring at the candlelight flickering on the wooden table in front of me. I thought about my family, my home, everything I was about to lose. But then I thought about Jesus. I thought about the warmth of His presence, the love in His eyes, the truth He had spoken to me. And I knew, no matter the cost, I had to follow Him. Even if it meant walking away from everything I had ever known, I couldn't turn back now. The decision was made for me the next morning. My father came to me before sunrise, his face stern, his eyes filled with something between sorrow and anger. "Jacob," he said, his voice heavy, "the elders have spoken. You are to be shunned." My breath caught in my chest, even though I had known this moment was coming. "You have turned from our ways, from the faith of our fathers. You are no longer welcome here." I searched his face, hoping for even a hint of hesitation, but there was none. My mother stood behind him, her lips pressed tightly together, her hands gripping the edge of her apron as if holding on for strength. She wouldn't look at me. My siblings stood silently in the doorway, their expressions unreadable. It was happening. I was losing them. "Father, please," I started, but he shook his head. "This is your choice, Jacob," he interrupted. "You chose this path." His voice wavered slightly, just for a second, but then it was gone. I had no time to pack, no time to say goodbye. I walked out of the only home I had ever known, the cold air stinging my face as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I had nowhere to go, no plan, no idea what would come next. But as I stepped away from my family, my community, my entire past, one thing remained certain. I was not alone. Jesus had sent me on this path, and wherever it led, I knew He would be with me. The first few days were the hardest. I had no money, no place to stay, and no idea what to do next. The Amish community had been my entire world, and now I was an outsider. I wandered from town to town, sleeping in barns or wherever I could find shelter. At times, doubt crept in. Had I made a mistake? Had I truly heard Jesus? Or had I just imagined it? But every time the fear tried to take hold, I felt a quiet assurance deep in my soul. "I am with you always." Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. I was sitting outside a small general store, exhausted and hungry, when I heard a familiar voice. "Jacob." I turned to see Caleb standing a few feet away, his expression a mixture of relief and hesitation. He had left the Amish community, too. "I couldn't stay," he admitted. "Not after what you told me. I want to know Jesus, really know Him." His words filled me with renewed strength. I wasn't the only one searching for something more. God was moving in ways I couldn't yet understand. With Caleb's help, I found a small church in town that welcomed us in. For the first time, I met people who followed Jesus not out of fear, but out of love. They didn't rely on rules to save them. They relied on him. They gave me food, shelter, and something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of belonging. I knew then that Jesus hadn't just called me out of my old life. He had called me into something greater. And as I stood in that church, surrounded by people who truly knew God's grace, I finally understood. This was just the beginning. As the days turned into weeks, my faith deepened in ways I had never imagined. For the first time, I wasn't following a set of rules to please God. I was seeking Him, knowing Him, and experiencing His presence in a way I never had before. I spent hours reading the Bible, and each word felt alive, as if God Himself was speaking directly to me. The weight of fear and striving I had carried my entire life was gone. I was finally free, but freedom came with a cost. News of my shunning had spread, and I soon learned that my family was forbidden from speaking to me. I sent letters, but they were never answered. I traveled back to the edge of my old community once, hoping to catch a glimpse of my mother or siblings. But when my father saw me, he turned his back and walked away. It hurt more than I could put into words. But even in that pain, I felt Jesus reminding me, "Follow me," and so I did. I began sharing my story with anyone who would listen. About the accident, the darkness, my encounter with Jesus, and the truth He had revealed to me. Some were skeptical, others curious, but a few saw the same truth that had changed my life. And one by one, they began to seek Jesus. Not through rules, not through religion, but through grace. It was then that I realized this was the reason Jesus sent me back. Not just to save me, but to help bring others to Him. The more I shared, the more I saw lives begin to change. People who had spent their whole lives fearing whether they were good enough started to understand that Jesus already loved them. Some were hesitant, afraid of what breaking from tradition would mean. But others, like Caleb, began experiencing the same freedom I had. It wasn't about abandoning everything we knew. It was about finally understanding that salvation wasn't something we could earn. It was a gift. But as more people listened, the opposition grew stronger. Word spread that I was leading others astray, that I had turned against the faith. Some former friends refused to look at me, others called me deceived. I received a letter from an elder of the community. "You are lost, Jacob. Turn back before it is too late." I read the words over and over, but I didn't feel anger. I felt sorrow. They were trapped in the same fear I had once lived in. I prayed for them. I prayed that one day, they too would experience the grace I had found. And through all the rejection, Jesus remained my anchor. Every night, I would kneel in prayer, feeling His presence as strongly as I had on that day in the light. He had not left me. He had not abandoned me. He had saved me so that I could help save others. No matter what it cost me, I knew one thing for certain. I would spend the rest of my life sharing this truth. Because if even one person found the freedom I had found, it would all be worth it. If you've made it this far, I want you to know, this message is for you too. You don't have to live in fear. You don't have to wonder if you're good enough. Jesus has already paid the price. His grace is enough. If you're struggling, if you felt the same emptiness I once did, call out to Him. He is waiting for you, and if this story spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let others know that salvation isn't about rules. It's about a relationship with Jesus. And if you want to hear more testimonies of people who have encountered God's grace, subscribe to this channel. Your journey isn't over. It's only just beginning,